As we know all too well, there are some truly sick and evil people out there in the world, but some are so strange, so unusual that you might even wonder if they are from another dimension. I know, it sounds insane, but you never know what in this crazy universe could be possible. With that said, let's dive in, cause today we're talking about the top 10 evil people who might be from a parallel universe. Starting us off at number 10, Jose Delgado. Starting us off strong, we're looking at an evil scientist. And I mean, what screams more possibility of a parallel universe than someone who's experimenting with technology ahead of their time? Jose Delgado graduated from the University of Madrid and later in 1946 went on to participate in a fellowship at Yale University. But Delgado was known for having an interest in a very peculiar line of research that left many of his peers uneasy: mind control. During his research, he was known to insert electrode implants into the brains of monkeys, and then using radio frequencies would force the primates to complete complicated movements. But that wasn't enough for the mad scientist. Next, he implanted electrodes into the brain of a bull before getting into a ring with him and making it charge at him, which he was able to successfully stop right before it hit him. From there, he began wiring up humans, but this time his device was not able to control them in the same way it had animals. This time the electrodes were only capable of inciting aggression, not pure mind control. But that wasn't gonna stop him. As he continued to aim for his mind control goals, he once famously said, quote, "We must electronically control the brain. Someday armies and generals will be controlled by electric stimulation of the brain." Now, was he stating a fact that he knew from another universe, or just a scientist gone mad? Let's hope it's the latter. Next up at number 9, Stubbins Firth. A famous physician, this guy may not have been the most evil on the list, but he might just be the most insane. Firth was a trainee doctor during the yellow fever epidemic in 1793 and had some rather interesting ideas about the disease. Now, yellow fever was one of the largest outbreaks in American history, killing roughly 10% of the population, so there was a lot of hands on deck at the time to try and get it under control. In 1801, Firth joined the University of Pennsylvania to begin researching the disease, as at the time no one knew what caused it or really how it transferred. Firth believed the disease was not contagious, and in an effort to prove his theory, he performed experiments on himself. Firth began bringing himself into direct contact with the infected bodily fluids, sometimes smearing vomit from infected patients into cuts on his arms, or even sometimes into his eyeballs. But he didn't stop there. He would smear his body with a myriad of other infected fluids from patients, and when he failed to contract the disease, he saw this as proof that yellow fever was not contagious. But later, when we understood the disease a little bit better, it was figured out that Firth was using samples from late-stage patients that were no longer contaminated with the virus. So he essentially did all that gross and insane stuff for nothing. Coming in at number 8, Robert G. Heath. Similarly to Jose Delgado, this evil scientist was also keen on diving into the world of mind manipulation, but not quite in the same way. Robert Heath was not as interested in domination of the brain so much as how to control the pleasure and pain receptors in the brain. While working at Tulane University, Heath discovered that by wiring up people's brains to electrodes, he was able to administer shocks that could either give them bursts of pleasure or pain depending on where he focused the shock. He went so far as inserting a narrow tube into the brain so that he could administer a chemical called acetylcholine, which resulted in virtual ecstasy and induced some rather pleasing events for those who received the shot. But on the flip, he could also cause complete and utter agony for the patients, making many wish that he would just kill them to end their suffering. Now, the reason that some think this guy could have maybe been from a parallel universe is because quite a few have since suspected Heath was involved with the CIA's illegal MK Ultra project and was researching mind control to help the government. And who better to help than someone from another dimension? Which, I mean, is it a conspiracy? Absolutely, but that doesn't mean it couldn't be possible. Coming in at number 7, Chris Watts. In 2018, Chris Watts came under a notorious spotlight for having convicted familicide, which is the killing of his entire family. Despite what seemed like a happy 6 years prior, one day Shannon, his wife, returned home from a business trip and everything was different. The couple got in a fight where Chris confessed he had a mistress and wanted to leave Shannon and get a divorce. Allegedly, Shannon threatened him, saying that if he did that, he would never see his family again. Chris then strangled his pregnant wife before loading her body along with the rest of their family into the car and driving it out into the woods to kill the last 2 members. Initially, Chris denied knowing the whereabouts of his wife, but just 2 days later confessed to the crimes. It came so out of left field that it almost seemed like a completely different person did the crimes. But no matter what you believe, at least the monster is behind bars for life. Coming in at number 6, Ilya Ivanov. Once again, another mad scientist on this list. Ilya Ivanov was a Soviet biologist who is famous for their studies on artificial insemination. But they also might be one of the most insane people I've ever read about. Now, to give you a bit of context, back in 1929, after years of campaigning, Ivanov was granted permission from the Bolshevik government to go ahead with his research. And what was that, you might be wondering? Well, Ivanov was trying to create a human-ape hybrid. Yes, you heard me right. Initially, it started out by the scientists grafting a human ovary into a chimp and then trying to fertilize the egg artificially, which is not great to begin with, but it got even crazier after that. Later that year, Ivanov traveled to Africa where he forcibly inseminated 3 chimps once again. When none of the animals fell pregnant, Ivanov decided to pivot into something even more drastic, impregnating a human woman with monkey sperm. Now, the wildest part of this is that he did manage to round up 5 volunteers for this experiment, but due to the political climate of the time, Ivanov was arrested and sent away to die, and the experiment was never finished. His research was so out of this world that it's hard not to wonder, was he maybe trying to recreate a species from an alternate universe that he was from? I guess we'll never know. Next up at number 5. Karl Clauberg. There were many evil scientists involved in World War II, and Karl Clauberg was among some of the most disgusting. Back in 1942, Clauberg approached Heinrich Himmler, who was a major figure in the German party at the time, and asked if he could receive a large number of women for research purposes. From there, his proposal was accepted, so off to the cruel camp he went. Once he was there, the so-called research began, and I mean truthfully, it was human torture under the guise of research. I'm sure you're wondering, just what was Clauberg experimenting? Well, he wanted to figure out how to sterilize women in the most cost-efficient way, so he would inject formaldehyde directly into their stomachs without any painkillers. He experimented on thousands of prisoners, but only 700 survived, although all were left sterile. Another thing he would do was inseminate the surviving prisoners and then torment them by lying and saying he injected them with animal sperm to try and create a monster. Now, I don't know what it is about evil scientists and trying to make people birth non-human beings, but I can only assume that in some other version of reality, it has happened. Next up at number 4, Dr. Kurt Blome. This man was also a member of the evil scientists during World War II, and just like the rest of them, performed indescribable acts on the prisoners. His main choice of torture was purposefully infecting the prisoners with cancer and typhus, but not because they were looking on how to cure it. No, they were literally looking on how to best cause it. The reason being that Blome was in charge of all biological warfare in the SS, and so his experiments aimed to find the best way to use these diseases against their enemies, debilitating them. Once he even proposed dropping infected mosquitoes into targeted populations to try and infect them with malaria. But what is truly mind-blowing about the whole situation is that despite being arrested and put on the doctor's trial in 1947, and admitting to what he had done, the US intervened in his prosecution for wartime atrocities and got him off the hook. From there, the US Army Chemical Corps hired him to work on biological warfare projects in their country that remain classified to this day. And I mean, that's just a little bit too suspicious, don't you think? Coming in at number 3, Jack Parsons. Okay, so you may have noticed a running theme here. There's a lot of evil scientists on this list, and I am not stopping that trend just yet. Although for Jack Parsons, he started to get a little weird later in life. Once a well-respected scientist and graduate of the California Institute of Technology, in 1939, Parsons did a 180 and converted to Thelema, which is a sort of philosophy religion movement that was developed by the famous occultist Aleister Crowley. So after joining Thelema, Parsons became a different person, frequently spotted dancing nude around a fire as part of a pagan ritual, among other previously uncharacteristic habits. Later, Parsons made friends with the Scientology founder, and the pair would often attempt to raise the mother of the Antichrist and summon spirits. Their methods to make that happen? Well, apparently Parsons would, well, let's just say, enjoy himself while Hubbard took notes, or Parsons and his mistress would go to the bedroom while Hubbard recited scripture. Some think the swift change in Parsons' entire personality could have been some kind of alternate version of him from another reality coming into this dimension, but as he's no longer alive, I guess we will never know for sure. Coming in at number 2, Warren Jeffs. If you are a true crime documentary lover like me, then I am sure this is not the first time you've heard the name Warren Jeffs. Although now he's in prison serving a life sentence for his crimes, those that are still in the FLDS continue to consider Jeffs as the leader and prophet and believe he's been wrongly convicted. For those that haven't seen the doc, let me give you a little bit of context. The FLDS stands for Fundamentalist Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. It's an extreme denomination of the Mormon Church that relies heavily on polygamy. Their belief is that in order to get into the highest rank of heaven, you must have at least 3 wives. But realistically, the more you have, the better in their eyes. Now, there is a lot to unpack with this entire denomination. Honestly, I could probably write a whole video on it alone. But essentially, what you need to know is that under Warren Jeffs' leadership, it came under fire as a hate group and a funnel for underage marriages. Prior to his arrest, it's believed Warren had 87 wives, many of which were not of legal age to marry, and he was not the only one in the FLDS to be in a similar situation. Using the excuse that God would come to him and tell him who was the next girl to be married off, he routinely placed very young girls with very old men and convinced his community that it was what God wanted. Warren Jeffs is truly a sick and evil man, and I am so glad they've got him locked up for life. And last up in our number 1 spot, Joseph Fritzl. Now, this might be one of the most heartbreaking cases I've ever read about. Born in 1935 in Austria, at 21, Joseph Fritzl married a girl named Rosemary, and the pair had 7 kids together. Now, he was a very man to everyone in his family, but especially Elizabeth. But the peak of his cruelty began when Elizabeth was 18. He lured her into the basement where he trapped her for the next 24 years of her life. In those 24 years, he assaulted her constantly, and during her imprisonment, she gave birth to 7 people. Of course, over the years, many were concerned about Elizabeth's disappearance, but Fritzl would lie and say that she'd ran off to join a cult and that he had no clue where she was. One day, after one of Elizabeth's offspring was ill, she managed to convince him to let them go to the hospital, and once they arrived, police were there on site to detain them. After making sure she would never be forced to see her father again, Elizabeth told authorities everything that her father ever did to her and her kin, and Fritzl was sentenced to life for his crimes. Some believe his acts were so cruel that he must have been from some parallel universe where Elizabeth wasn't his daughter, as it was so hard to believe that someone could do that to their own family. Thanks so much for watching, guys. I'm Kennedy. Make sure to hit the subscribe button, and I'll see you next time.